Hello and welcome to Minute JavaScript, where I talk about topics quickly and concisely. Today I'll be covering a topic that seems to confuse a lot of developers, and that is this. But first I'd like to thank those who have been supporting the channel, my new subscribers. So I'd like to issue a thanks to Stephen, Edward, Leon, Venkataramana, St. Das, Ariel, Tong, M. Tariq, Daika, Abdurrahman, Muhammad, Adnan, Alan, Israel Martinez, Alejandro, Melo, Paul, Kenneth, and Nepo. It's your support that keeps this channel going, so I'd like to thank all of you. I really do appreciate it. And if you're a new developer and interested in learning JavaScript, consider subscribing yourself. So we'll start by looking at some simple code. Here I have a cat object that has a property called name. It also has a function called speak. And if I were to ask you what speak returns, most people would probably say Mojo says meow. And that's because when you see this.name, you immediately look over to name here. But what you're doing is you're also assuming that this is actually cat. But this doesn't work that way in JavaScript. This is actually a function argument. And I'll show you what I mean. So what most people think when they see this is they're going to think of this cat.speak, where it does correctly return Mojo says meow. But I like to think of this as shorthand for cat.speak.call cat, which returns Mojo says meow. Now, if you're curious about this syntax, I have another video that covers call that you may want to check out, and I'll link that in the comments below. But the gist of what we're doing here is I'm calling the speak function, and I'm passing in my this context as cat, which when invoked here, this will be cat. And we can compare that to line 8, where the environment is automatically sending cat as the this context. And the confusion happens with this when the environment is setting this to something other than you expect. So line 8 and line 9 do the same things. The difference is that this on line 8 is passed in implicitly, while on line 9, I'm passing in cat as this explicitly. And the confusion happens with this when the implicit passing of this is different than what you were expecting. Here's one example of that. If I were to create a new function called speak and I were to just assign it to cat.speak, I can see here that speak is my speak function. So I would assume that I could just call it like any other function, but instead of getting Mojo says meow like the other ones do, I'm getting undefined here. And that's because when I'm assigning the function cat.speak to speak, this becomes dereferenced. So if I were to write code in this style, I would have to explicitly bind cat to the speak function so the this context will get set correctly. And now you can see on line 12, it actually changed from undefined to Mojo says meow. Now another example of this is if I were to have a function, and I'll just call it my function, and my function actually takes function itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say the value is the function. I'm just going to execute it, and I'm going to console log value. Now if I were to call my function, and I were to pass in cat.speak as my function, I get the same bug in my code as I did previously on line 12, where it says undefined says meow. So again, I'm going to have to call bind explicitly, and I'm going to get Mojo says meow. Now another thing I sometimes get tripped up on is if I'm passing in, let's say, my cat here, and I'm going to call cat.speak. There we go. So now I have my function. It accepts a cat, it calls cat.speak on it, and then I log out the value. And I get a correct value where it says Mojo says meow. But if I were to destructure this, I don't want to pass in the whole cat value. I just want the speak function. So I'm going to use object destructuring to destructure speak out of it, and I'm going to call speak here. And now you can see when I pass in cat as before, I do get my speak function and it is being called, but I'm getting undefined. And again, that's because of the way that the this context becomes dereferenced. So how can we tell what this is going to be? An easy rule of thumb is to look at what is before the dot in the function call. So here my function is speak, and I can see that cat is before the dot. So cat is going to become the this argument. Whereas when we look at the broken version of speak, when we're getting undefined and I look at speak, there's no dot before the function call. In this case, the this argument is going to be set to the global context. So it's always safer to write your calls that use this explicitly, but nobody actually does this in practice. We all kind of rely on the implicit call of speak. which is the reason why we have so many bugs relating to this in our code. Now let's look at another example. Let's say I had a house object instead of a cat object, and inside my house I had a cat. So in this example, instead of calling cat.speak, I would have to call house.cat.speak. Now the equivalent of this, if I were to use the call method, would be house.cat. Oops, let's add house there. And again, using the implicit rule set, everything before the dot becomes the this context. So speak is my function, here's my dot, and house.cat is going to become the this argument. And you can see that here when I call it explicitly. And another example where people tend to get tripped up is having multiple nested functions. So let's say if I had inside of my speak function another function, I'm just going to call that say meow. And this line is going to be in here, and at the end of speak, I'm just going to return say meow. Now when I look at my code here, I can see that my house.cat.speak is returning undefined, and that is because the this argument inside of say meow is different than the this argument inside of speak. Now remember that this is a function argument, so the arguments for calling speak are different than the arguments for calling meow. And that not only applies to the arguments, but the this argument also. And that's why you should always look at this as an argument. So ES6 introduced the concept of arrow functions, and if I were to convert this standard function into an arrow function, all I would have to do is eliminate the function keyword, and I would say const say meow equals, and then I'm going to say no arguments arrow and function body. Now if you were to look down below on line 13, you could see that Mojo actually says meow. And that is because inside of an arrow function, this has a lexical context. What that basically means is say meow has no this argument. So what's going to happen, because you're calling this here, it's going to look in the scope that this function resides in. In that case, the scope of that is the speak function. So this is going to use the this argument from speak. So now on line 13, our implicit call to cat.speak is returning Mojo says meow, which is the correct result. So just keep in mind when using apply binder call will allow you to explicitly set this. Also when calling a function, whatever is before the dot of the function call becomes the this argument. Also when creating a function where you want to use the parent's this argument and not the this argument of your function, you can use an arrow function. Thank you for spending your time with me to watch this video. I do appreciate it. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.